Hello, and welcome to our 13th lesson in the course Reawaken the Dream, a course for writer moms or anyone who has the problem of needing to write in fragmented time segments. And we are working in this whole second part of the course. We are working on building the power of living characters through the character profile diagram and now the character profile tool, a very, very practical tool to help you write successfully in fragmented time segments. Last lesson, we covered affability. And we saw that in the triad of emotions for affability, the struggle was the dog model, friendliness. Dogs tend to be basically friendly with others of their own species, but you're kind of pushing things if you're going to put their food bowls side by side and move them into the same house. Now there might be a little bit of a struggle to be affable. And affability refers to the debt of civility that we owe one another. Our lost state were quarreling and flattery. Now, quarreling, we aren't really talking about fights where the anger breaks out. And we're not talking about debates of principles and ideas. No, we're talking about quarreling, just plain being disagreeable and just being ornery with the people that probably ought to be the closest to you in your life, and you're just plain ornery. And the other lost state was flattery, where you're not genuine with the other person. You're kind of trying to butter them up for something. And maybe something as simple as a salesman complimenting the customer on how nice the garment looks on them. But it could go rather dark when it comes to trying to gain an advantage on someone. So that gave us two aspects of our triad. The victory side of the triad of affability was the kind word or gesture. Hi, smile on the face, and also welcoming strangers. We have to be somewhat reserved, but to not be exclusive or put offish. And the empathy group now has 3 character traits with the addition of affability. It goes along with responsibility and loyalty that we covered earlier. So now, are you ready for this week's new character trait? This week's character trait is foresight. Foresight, looking ahead and perceiving the path to achieve a goal. This will seem a lot like circumspection, looking around to assess current situations. But before we go into the analysis, we always do our scenarios. Martin had put a lot of effort into his plan to renovate the community garden. When he first came up with the idea, nobody was talking about renovating that space. It had just been allowed to get run down. But he talked to people and he talked it up and he drew up plans and he got enthusiasm going. And finally it came before the city council and they voted the funds to renovate the community garden. Martin was so happy, except that they had to open it up to proposals. And Martin's wasn't the only one out there. He was particularly concerned about the proposal that was being put forth by the owner of the local sand and gravel company. His plan was super heavy on hardscape, and he had promised, and that made it very difficult for Martin to compete. He had said that all of the materials that come from his company, he would give to the city at cost. And with that tremendous savings, Martin was very frightened that his proposal would get the final vote. He was tempted to see if there might be some way he could cheat and short circuit things and maybe buy off some votes on the council. Nah, he couldn't do anything like that. What he'd have to do would be knuckle down and lobby some more and call everybody again and talk to everybody one more time. Foresight. Victor was the owner of the local sand and gravel company. The community where he lived, the city council had voted some funds to renovate the community gardens. He hadn't paid any attention to it when that fellow was busy trying to talk it all up. Besides, the guy was talking about using all natural materials. But when he saw the amount of money that the city council had approved for the project, he put his thinking cap on. He figured out that he could put together a phony baloney proposal where he just said, hey, look, I'll give you all of the materials that come from my shop at cost. All the concrete at cost, all the cinder block at cost. And of course, his design was heavy on concrete everywhere. He had it all figured out. If he just laid it all out so that he managed to spend all the money, when the project was about 3/4 done, hey, the city council would have no choice but to vote the balance of the funds to finish the project, and he would make a mint. Too bad if the money ran out before the green stuff went in. The do-gooders could come along and add that later. He was all set. He worked on his proposal. He came before the council, and he was sure that he would have the victory. Little did he realize the power of one-to-one communications. The natural guy won. They voted his proposal down. Foresight. Silas had always wanted to be an engineer. He'd been putting together projects in his basement since he was a little boy. And now the prospects of going to college and studying engineering were scaring him to death. He wasn't good at math. And he was afraid the more he looked at the catalog, the more he looked at the courses he'd have to take, he was sure he wouldn't be able to do the mathematics. So he pushed his dream of being an engineer aside and began to look for another major. Foresight. Elena needed to get the family to Montana. Her husband was already there. He was already working on his new job. But it had taken a long time to sell the house. And now it was mid-November. And she had to somehow get the kids, 3 kids, and the car and herself and, the dog, to Montana. She was worried about it because the roads, she had to go through mountain passes. What if there was snow on the ground? What if she had to put on chains? Her husband wouldn't be there with her. The movers had already been scheduled. She only had a little time left to plan. What should she do? Foresight. Foresight, as we'll soon see, is a member of the insight group, our second character trait in the insight group. And if you'll remember from making our reference sheets, there's only 3 character traits in the insight group. It's a pretty lofty group. In fact, some consider it the king of the character traits. But when you look at foresight and its brother trait, circumspection, there's immediately some questions because they seem very, very similar. And it's necessary to keep the two apart to understand the triad of emotions, because that's the point of contact with the less verbal side of our brain, is the emotions. And intellectually, these two are very, very similar, but we will see that emotionally they're different. And if you don't get the emotions down right, you don't get any power. Circumspection was the ability to look around at all the present circumstances and judge them correctly. Whereas foresight is the ability to look ahead to the goal and plan a wise course to get to the goal. From a brain standpoint, they seem to be quite similar. They both use similar centers of the brain for reasoning. But let's look at the actual triad of emotions. Let's look at the struggle. The struggle of circumspection was the dog that wanted to get to the food that was behind the fence. The fence didn't go very far, but the dog didn't know he could get around the fence. We have a different animal this time. We have a squirrel. And you might think, well, animals aren't capable of foresight. Well, here's a perfect animal model for foresight. Here's a squirrel. Here's a tree. You recognized it at once, I hope. I'm such a brilliant artist. With a branch. And the family has hung up a bird feeder. How long do you think it will take the squirrel, using his limited animal powers of foresight, to find a way to the bird feeder, even if the latest model is guaranteed squirrel-proof? The struggle. Well, when we look at the struggle, what we want to realize is that what we're looking at is not the goal of getting there. That's not in the character trait of foresight. What we're looking here is the means of getting there, a choice of means. And we have a choice of noble versus evil means. You've always heard the phrase, the end justifies the means. Well, you know that means and the end are very different then. And there is a temptation to say, my cause is noble, so therefore I can do a shortcut and use a not quite so noble means. Probably not very wise. We can never take into account all of the circumstances between us and the goal. And if we misjudge, all we'll end up is the shortcut, the evil that we did taking the shortcut. Instead, we probably want to choose a route that is wise and also noble. Because the other choice of the means that could be a mistake is if we choose an unwise means. The intentions were there, the goal, the plan was to do good the whole way, but the choice may not have been wise. And the other side of the whole thing, this has to do with the path chosen, and this one has to do with, did we even take the time and trouble to make a plan? Did we do the foresight? So you see there's two kinds of struggle. The struggle to do it, and then the struggle to make a good choice of means. Forgetting for the moment goal. Hopefully our characters will have a good goal, unless they're a villain. And if they're a villain, their goal may not be very good at all, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to employ foresight. Since foresight is a very intellectual activity, we have to be careful that we reach the emotional center, because that's the whole point of these character traits, is that we develop a communication path between our intellectual side of our brain and the less verbal side of our brain. So it's easy to touch the emotions of victory. We've made a good plan and we've put it into action. Can't you just feel that? Yes, I made a good choice. What about the emotions of loss? Well, you didn't. Where's the emotion in that? We had the same problem with circumspection, if you'll remember. Circumspection was you got to the top of the hill and you could see all around, and you had that wonderful sense of mastery of your environment and your circumstances. And failure was you didn't get up the hill. We had no emotional power until we looked at the modifiers. Usually for most traits, scale is about the only modifier that you've got going, and the struggle is independent of the modifiers. But what we have here with the modifiers, just like in circumspection, all of the power of emotion is in the details. So if we don't look at the modifiers, we have no point of communication for the lost state of foresight. So let's take a look at what those are. We've already had a villain. Remember with circumspection? We took down the villain because he got so smug that he stopped doing circumspection. He began to neglect circumspection. This time, we have a different path to taking down the villain. It's going to be harder for him to neglect foresight. He's going for that goal. That's straight line, doesn't take anything out of the way. But what the villain is going to do, and the way we're going to take him down, is through misjudgment. And what villains are very, very prone to is to underestimate the value of the good path, to underestimate the power of those whom he considers weaker than himself. And so that's our second path for taking down a villain. Does this mean that negligence doesn't come into play? Oh, it definitely comes into play, because now it's in a different circumstance. Our character might be living, his life might be too chaotic. He might not be able to get to do the foresight that he needs to do just because his life is so chaotic. Or he might have limiting self-beliefs, and in which he's just not capable of doing the full foresight because he's already shut down part of the field from his view because of limiting self-beliefs. And so so negligence still will come into play, though usually not with our villain. What about our teen? Remember with circumspection, the teen said, danger? What danger? Well, what we're going to see with the teen is we're going to see short-sightedness. He's going for his goal, and he just doesn't think to take into account other factors. He thinks he's doing foresight, but he's really short-sighted in the activity. And the last one is resistance. And resistance can take place when the future's cloudy. When the future is cloudy and fear starts to come into the picture, then you can get resistance to doing foresight. It's like, not today, not today, not today. So now we're going to get back into building our character profile tool. We've had 2 weeks on the topic already. The first lesson, we covered how to physically create the character profile tool. We talked about how to physically draw a character profile diagram and put it on a card. We saw that we created for ourselves worksheets, reference sheets of the character, all of the character groups and the character traits within the group. Here's one that you might actually be able to read. What we did was we took the group, and then for each character trait, we jotted down the struggle, the loss, and the victory so that we would have a reference. That's all we did with them on the first week. On the second week, we focused in on creating the character profile diagrams from characters that we created ourselves. Remember Nick, our friendly, affable guy? And this is where we created the process of placing traits on a new card, the memory prompt list. Here's Nick's memory prompt list. Remember how we picked a character trait and we pictured Nick being in a scene where that character trait was either how it came about in him or a scene that illustrated it for him. And we created in our mind a micro vignette, a little scene, a little scenario. And we wrote a few words down to bring that micro vignette back. And we focused in on the emotional punch because we're drawing on the work of the people who do the memory palace, the memory experts who always could create this giant list of things and remember them all because of using an emotional punch where each trait was stored in their memory palace with an emotional punch. So we're picking up that attribute. And once we had our character profile, the emotional punch, then we placed the trait on the character profile diagram where it went. Now, this was all well and good if the character that you're working with has a character profile that we are building up by selecting the character trait in advance. We do this every week with our exercises. The homework exercises for this week will be no exception. We'll be running through each of those modifiers so we can understand the different loss states of foresight. And we'll be creating characters to go with the scenarios. And so those are fairly easy because you start with the character trait and you go to the diagram. But what do we do if our character comes into our story full blown, as it were? Many of our characters or our stories come out of our lives and our experiences. And so the characters that we are writing from have separate lives, and we might not automatically know what their character traits are. Does that mean that we're stuck in the position like the psychoanalyst, where we have to have years and years of training to be able to figure out the character traits? No, it's not quite that difficult because we can do something that the psychoanalyst can't do. We can do mind reading, and we've got to do mind reading. So that's what we're going to focus on in building our character profile tool today. We're going to talk about creating a character profile for a character who's already living in our heads. I'm going to use an example from a character from a novel that I'm writing. His name is Edwin. He's a retired college professor and the grandfather of the hero in our story, Jonathan. So I'm going to pretend that I want to figure out Edwin's traits. We don't have a full-blown set of character traits at this point in time. We only have 8 character traits. So it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. We certainly won't be able to guarantee that we have a completed character profile diagram. We've got 20 traits yet to discover. But in the process of doing this, you get used to the idea of how it's done. You spend time visiting your characters so you know them better. And there's a good chance that even if you may not find his rudder trait, the key one that's going to drive the story, you might well find traits in the other positions. So let's go through the method. Before we do, I want to offer a little something to you. I don't know if you noticed, but these are behaving a lot better for me this week than they have in weeks past. And the secret is I stuck something in the inside. I cannibalized a vinyl pocket folio. I cut the sheets down to fit in between my character profile sheets and stuck them in my page protectors. And now my page protector doesn't flop all over the place. It's much easier to handle. So that's just a little hint that I'm going to share with you. We won't need it for this practice drill because we're going to use these, which will be a substitute for these. You can't, the other ones you can't read. This, at least you can read the group and the character trait itself, although I just have the word struggle, loss, victory, and on your reference sheet you'll have a description in your own words of the struggle, the loss, and the victory. So how are we going to go about doing this? Well, first of all, we'll take out Edwin's blank character profile diagram and a blank memory prompt list. Then what we'll do is we'll take out our reference sheets. And what we're going to do is we're going to visit the character traits one by one, and we're going to try to imagine Edwin in a scenario in which that character trait is involved. We're not going to spend too much time with each one because when we have all 28, that's a lot to go through. But we'll find that if we flip through them and just say, orderly, self-control, responsibility, loyalty, affability, affability, yes. So when it clicks like that, now you go into the second stage. And in the second stage, you stop and think to yourself, where does affability fall for our character? And we discover in the scenarios with this character trait is that he can be polite when he wants to be, but he sure is snarly with his wife. Sounds to me like affability is a wing trait for Edwin. So, having affability as a wing trait, I can now take out the memory prompt list, write in affability, and put down as the reason the scenario that I just came up with in my mind, picturing him being snarly with his wife. And if I do the job of taking a moment here, because this is where you install them, you only need 8 plus a few maybe extra base or pinnacle traits. This is not a huge investment in time for the power that it's going to give you back. To spend a little bit of time when you write that down, really, really, really getting into the emotions of it. And when you place it on his character profile diagram, really feel those emotions when you place the trait. So this is something that you're going to need to do. I was tempted to give it to you as a homework assignment, but if I did, I would have to skip a week and not go to our next character trait because we need to install foresight. And that means we need to play with scenarios for foresight. So this is not your homework assignment, but this is a very important background assignment that you can fill in as you go. And that would be if you are working on a project right now and you have characters that you are writing into your story, it's time to take each of the character traits that you have so far, all 8, and go down and practice this with each one. See if you can feel the trait as being a part of that character's character profile diagram. And if you get a match, add it to the memory prompt list and place it in the character profile diagram following the techniques that we went through last week. So that's quite a bundle, but next week, are we done with the character profile tool? No. Next week, we're going to start in on how you use the character profile tool when you sit down to write. And of course, we'll be working on our 9th character trait. So see you then. Bye-bye.